Welcome to the 14 Winds podcast, where we talk about UFOs and all the related high strangeness. I'm Bones, and with us, as always, is Ramex.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Ram. So here we are. We're going to continue with our discussion about the occult and Nazism, and how it all kind of tied together during World War II. And then I suppose these episodes, they get long because we have so much to say, but then next episode we'll get into it even deeper, kind of post-World War II. Is that what we're going to do?
Yeah, we'll talk about where these ideas went after World War II. But I think in the last episode, we kind of talked about where they came from and how they got into the Nazi theology. And now we'll talk about how they bloomed after that. And then we'll talk about what happened to them following the war in the next episode.
Okay, great. So a lot of it started in the 19th century, right? I mean, a lot of I think I recall last episode we talked about a lot of movements at the turn of the century.
Right. Yeah, the revival of spiritualism. We talked about Helena Blavatsky really coming in and sort of resetting the field for Hermeticism, and we talked about how that inspired a lot of occultists at the time in a lot of different directions. So like Crowley and the Golden Dawn went in a different direction. And then these guys, Guido von List, as well as Liebenfels, they sort of took it and moved it towards a more Aryan or Ariosophy, which was a blending of Blavatsky's theosophy with a bunch of eugenic ideas about how the Nazi Party and Germans were physically and biologically better.
Right.
And then they wound that into a history which involved an Atlantis-like society that would have been the Aryans. And so they were looking for this lost Aryan technology that had been from their past.
And then from what I understand is that it developed into this occult, and then kind of when fascism really grabbed hold of it all, they kind of wanted to get rid of the occult a little bit because those in power got what they wanted. But then mysticism in itself is kind of a personal experience, right? So it kind of promoted too much independence, and the Nazis kind of had to rein it in, right?
Yeah, that's a good little preview of what we'll talk about today. I think we kind of set some of that up, and we'll go through the timeline. So
yeah.
In advance of this, I put together a timeline of events from World War II, and that's because high school was a long time ago. I know that dates and the years are going to get lost on people, but they are important to the whole story. So we'll kind of go through that blow by blow of like how the Nazis got really into it, where Hitler was like, enough of this stuff, where he couldn't really fight it, that sort of thing.
Right.
So that's a great setup. We'll start with really World War I. And the end of World War I put Germany into a really bad spot. So there was the Treaty of Versailles, and they had to pay out a bunch of reparations. They had lost the war, and the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, so people were losing their jobs. You had a working class in Germany that became angry and prone to wild thinking. And that's going to happen, right? You're watching machines take your jobs, just like today. You're watching machines take your jobs, and you're like, well, who owns the machines?
Right.
And who's behind it all? And if God's real, where is he? And all these questions start to come up to people, right? And so it's within that environment that these Nazi occult ideas really start to take hold. And that's really important.
Sure, yep. Taking advantage of people's disadvantages, basically.
Right. These ideas are usually not prevalent in groups that aren't vulnerable. You'll see rich people and people who are well-connected join cults and go off the deep end, but not in nearly as great as proportions as people who are searching for anything, who are desperate. So there was a lot of desperate people at the time, and the Thule Society saw that. We mentioned them, and they get involved in a lot of lore, and they get involved in a lot of conspiracies. And they're a great one for us to clear up a little bit, because their role was very important. They backed Hitler prior to him really taking control. And they did so by promoting these occult beliefs within the lower classes. So you had wealthy occultists going out and actively recruiting the lower classes and even luring them away from Christianity. I mean, this is the type of conspiracy they talk about today, right?
Yeah, right.
And it really occurred back then. And it was the Thule Society that was behind it. And Himmler was, of course, majorly involved in this as well and very supportive of it. But here's where it gets interesting. I'll jump ahead a little bit with the Thule Society, because when Hitler comes to power, they end up saying, hey, we backed Hitler before he was powerful and the leader of Germany. And then Hitler says, hey, shut up. No one backs Hitler except Hitler. And he shuts him down, right? He says, no more of these secret societies. And then he wants to own occultism, and so does Himmler. So it really gets wrapped into the SS at that point. So a lot of these conspiracies around the Thule Society, we're going to clean up a few of these around the lore, are misinformation. Like, so they did have that important role, but then they got shut down, and the occultism got pulled into the SS.
Right. I always find I find it fascinating how occultism flourishes amongst the wealthy and privileged. It's almost dark. I mean, you can understand how, like, new religions pop up out of public desperation, times of trouble, right? Because people are looking for answers. But then when you got the privilege, standing up high, and they're meddling in the occult and kind of just using the public as their playthings. It's a dark thing. Sometimes.
It is dark, and it gives birth to a lot of these conspiracy theories, and I can see why. I mean, I think it's worth asking the question as to, like, why would someone with millions of dollars and everything they could imagine be dabbling in the occult and dark stuff like this? Like, that's a valid question.
Boredom.
Yeah. I think in some cases boredom is true, but in this case, they actually used it with intent, with an agenda.
Right.
They actually intentionally wanted to separate people from their own religions and bring them into a new occult Nazism, right? Ariosophy. And this is another thing we can clear up here. There's been an effort to say that Nazism was okay with Christianity. And I think that's in order to recruit Christians into Nazism. That couldn't be further than the truth.
Right.
They absolutely had a problem with Christianity. Hitler was very explicit about his issues with Christianity. He didn't want them interfering with his power. And Himmler was very explicit about his reasons for hating Christianity. And number one was their sexual morality, he thought was stifling. And number two was their compassion.
Ah, sure.
He hated Christianity for the empathy and compassion, the central message of Christ's teaching.
Right.
He hated Christianity for that. These were the most powerful men in Germany, without question. They did not like Christianity. They were actively attacking Christianity.
But not publicly, obviously.
Oh, publicly. No.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it was very public. It is known. This is in their journals. They were saying it to people. This is not...
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It is completely... I'm glad you said that. That's just a complete myth that is really been spread with an agenda. And we're going to talk about a few of those that got involved in the lore. And the calls are coming in from inside the house on some of this stuff, where the UFO community is promoting things that have been clearly debunked and are clearly hoaxes with an intent to whitewash some of the Nazi Party stuff. And we'll jump right into one of the big ones there, because I think it's fascinating. And it's Maria Orsic, which you've heard her name, right? And seen it in different History Channel documentaries.
Of course.
She's fiction. And this one, I have to admit, got me until I looked into it. But she is a fictional character. There is no record of her existing.
Yeah, that is wild.
The guys who ended up coming up with her story produced a document that was clearly a composite and a fake. So the only document that's ever been produced that shows that she existed was fake. And then there's a whole series of ideas that come from that idea where, Maria Orsic was Hitler's psychic and she was involved with this Vril Society. Well, the Vril Society didn't exist. I already told you the Thule Society did. And then the occult got rolled into the SS. And that's going to be important. And we really need to follow that thread. So we need to clean this stuff up. There was no Vril society. They did think that there was some connections to Inner Earth, but like I told you, they were really thought it was a connection to something like Atlantis, and that their ancestors were something like the Atlanteans. That's the best way for me to summarize it. But it wasn't this Vril society. It wasn't the Edward Bulwer-Lytton stuff. I won't even get into that too much, but you're going to hear it and see it in documentaries, and it's fiction. Like, it's not true. And the important thing to know here is that they shut down the Thule Society. And at that point, Himmler and Wiligut, who we talked about last time, Himmler ran the SS. Wiligut was his guru. Himmler brings in Wiligut to sort of become the bishop of the Nazi party. And Wiligut starts designing the symbols that had occult significance, and all of that is happening within the SS. And as we said, Hitler was not that big a fan. But let's go through the timeline, because that'll clear it up a little more for you. So in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, after World War I, puts Germany in a really bad spot. They have to pay all these reparations. People are bringing wheelbarrows full of money to get bread. The bread lines are out of control. The Nazi Party starts growing within that. And Hitler becomes involved in 1920. So the occultism thing is going here. The Thule Society is active and promoting Hitler during that time. And then Hitler has a failed coup attempt in 1923 called the Beer Hall Putsch. Very famous, right? And he goes to jail. He goes to prison. And Hess goes with him. And it's Hess that he dictates Mein Kampf to. Hess writes it all down. And Hess, as we mentioned, Rudolf Hess, who was Hitler's deputy, was a true believer in all of this occultism. And he believed that Hitler was something like a Teutonic Messiah.
Okay.
While Hess and Hitler are spending 10 years in jail, Himmler is growing in power within the brown shirts and what would become the SS later. And Himmler is kind of a weird little wimp. And he's not a big tough guy, but he's hanging around all these tough guys. And this becomes important later on. And he really wants to be like a knight, and he really wants to be strong, and it becomes a big part of his character.
Yeah, one of those people where they're really cowards, but they're always tough when they're around their group of buddies, right?
Exactly. So historians, even today, I've heard them say that, oh, if Himmler were alive today, he'd be in his mother's basement, like posting Nazi stuff online, and he's that type, right? And he got into power, and that's where he was making his move from. He was making his move from within sort of that movement. So he grows in power, and then the Great Depression begins in 1929, and there's economic collapse all over the world. And it's good to remember that the U.S. is facing all of that at the same time, too. We're in the midst of all that. And the U.S. doesn't even want to enter World War II, right, until Pearl Harbor happens. In 1933, there's the Reichstag fire. And this is probably started by the Nazis, and they blamed it on the Jews, and then used that as a reason to take control of what was a multi-party government and put it all under their control.
Right.
And in the confusion after the Reichstag fire, and with this lower class army that they had built up, they were able to do that. So the occultism got really important in that moment, right? They probably wouldn't have had that type of army without a theology, because it gave their would-be soldiers something like a Valhalla or a jihad or some sort of greater purpose that they were going toward.
Right. So it wasn't just economic turmoil. There was a deeper meaning behind it all to drive them even more. Exactly.
You needed both. In order to remove the lower classes from their religion and really own them, you needed both. Times of transformation tend to require creation and destruction. So you needed some means of destruction, and they understood this very well. This wasn't just philosophy to them. It was very intentional. Like Himmler
Right.
and Wiligut, they were like, we're going to destroy the Christian religion and replace it with this. We're going to just eliminate Jews entirely and anyone else we consider undesirable. But Christianity we're going to replace. Again, as physical proof of that, there are all of these amphitheaters that Himmler had built all over Germany with the intention of replacing the churches. And instead, he saw a future where this folk-like German culture would come to these amphitheaters and celebrate the two solstices, and instead of Christmas, they were going to celebrate Yule, which was going to replace Christmas.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Strange.
It is strange, and I didn't know it until I had done the deep research. Because these ideas have been whitewashed.
Well, a lot of people in history, a lot of people focus on the scapegoatism, of all the victims of Nazism. It always kind of skips right to that. It's just hate and all that, but it was deeply rooted and organized.
Absolutely. We'll get to the Holocaust, but all of this had to happen prior to the Holocaust in order to get people to engage with something so horrible.
Right.
And we just can't skip over it, or you really lose the heart of the movement, which is still very relevant today.
Right.
So in 1934, another big moment happens, and this is the Night of the Long Knives. And this is when Hitler and Himmler really take control of the Nazi Party. In order to do that, Hitler invites Ernst Röhm, who is then the leader of the SA, which would sort of predate the SS, and he invites him and his entourage to a private meeting where they're going to sort out their differences. Instead, he has Himmler use his guys to kill them all in their hotel rooms.
Okay, yeah, right.
And just like that, Himmler, Hess, and Hitler, of course, take control of the Nazi Party entirely, in Germany, really, entirely.
Right.
And it was at that point that Himmler, not Hitler, was able to really start getting into his occult beliefs. So now that Himmler, Hess, and Hitler have control, Himmler is able to turn the SS into the occult engine that he always wanted to. And this is where his obsession with knights and dragons and Arthurian legend would really start showing up. He wants to build his own castle. He wants 12 key leaders to be his knights. He even builds within the castle something like a round table that would be Arthurian legend. And then I found out more. We set it up a little bit in the last time. I said we wanted to dig into this more, but he said he claimed to have a series of visions, and I thought that was interesting. And the visions that he claimed to have were that he was a legendary German king, Heinrich, that had been reincarnated, and this was his great grand destiny.
Oh, how convenient.
Right. There was no proof of that. I'm just going to leave it there.
Right. No phonographic evidence.
But he did see himself as the high priest of Nazi occultism. So he was the driver behind things like looking for the Ark, looking for the Spear of Destiny, looking for all sorts of Nazi and other religious artifacts, too. They went to Tibet searching for all sorts of things. They were really interested in Tibet because Blavatsky said that she had had her revelations in Tibet. Their assumption was that they were going to go to Tibet and find evidence of their Aryan ancestors.
Right.
Their assumption was that when they found the Ark, it was going to have evidence that it belonged to some sort of Teutonic or Nazi tradition. That's what they thought.
But as we know, that just led to the melting of Nazi faces in the end.
Yeah. Well, they did find the Karl hole, as I mentioned, in Russia. And this is a subterranean structure that is yet to be studied in earnest. But it has been studied by one team of speleologists or spelunkers, right, who went down there and mapped the whole thing, videoed the whole thing. And then another guy went back in 2019. But there's yet to be a real archaeology team go out there and study this subterranean structure that has megalithic blocks that resemble the Great Pyramid
Yeah.
and could be prehistoric. And the Nazis found it. This is very interesting. One of the things the guy who rediscovered the cave later in the 2000s found was a actual World War II Nazi marking near the site. And then they found another swastika-like symbol that was much, much older. Possibly prehistoric and belonged to the people who created the site. So again, the Nazis thought, oh, we're finding our history.
Right, right.
That's what they wanted. But they were finding anomalous structures. And then there's Wewelsburg Castle. And it was designed as a ritual and initiation center in the SS. All the Nazi symbology around the castle, like the Black Sun mosaic. And there was the Hall of the Dead for what would be the SS Grail Knights. They wanted to create their own Grail Knights. And they had a hall with their different positions on it, where they would do these occult rituals. Now, the strange thing about Wewelsburg Castle is we don't know a ton of what happened in there. The SS were pretty tight with what went on there. And then they were killing people who knew. And then after the war, they were attempting to burn it all down, but looters got there first to a lot of it and clearing the place out. So it was probably packed with tons. Well, we know it was packed with tons of artifacts and treasures from all over the world that then went out into the black market. But a lot of that was being directed also by Himmler's guru, Karl Maria Wiligut. And we set him up in the last episode. And as we mentioned, he was a veteran of World War I who then got involved in the Masons and some secret societies and the occult. And then he finds his way into Germany, right, where he meets Himmler at like what would be an alternative media conference, right, around German history, where Himmler's like, hey, I like what you have to say about the Nazis being Atlantean Aryans from another time. Right. We should hang out. And so they get very close. So he ends up making Wiligut the head of his history department and the Ahnenerbe, which is the Nazi archaeology wing. And when you see the villains in Raiders of the Lost Ark, that would be the Ahnenerbe. They were really going around the world with soldiers trying to steal precious artifacts. And Wiligut was the head of that group. So it was his ideas, right? That's super important because then you know, oh, it was his ideas that they were running around the world pursuing.
And that was part of the SS then?
Correct. Okay. So at that point, all of the occultism starts to roll under the SS. And Hitler is worried about other things. He's worried about more power. He's worried about taking more territory. He's worried about the army. This occultism only helps him to the extent that it helps motivate his army. And then he's willing to listen to astrologers. And we'll talk about that too. He's willing to listen to astrologers and mediums when he thinks they have good information. If he thinks there's advanced technology, he's interested in that. But its only function, the push, and the theology and the mythology is all growing out of the SS. Wiligut ends up structuring the SS in the occult ways based off of the Masonic orders that he had been a part of. And even though Himmler had a big problem with Masons, so did Hitler. They wanted them nowhere near their country because, again, they just don't want any secret societies that they don't control.
Right.
They were more than happy to take some of those Masonic rituals and make them part of the SS. And then Wiligut also starts involving a lot of runes, a lot of old neo-pagan and pagan runes. So that gets interesting for occultists. What I would say is that they end up becoming a cult. Not just a cult, but a cult with a C. C-U-L-T.
Yeah.
Because they have a belief in a supernatural Messiah with Hitler. They have a belief in a whole new theology. And then they have the same tactics of brainwashing that we use to define what a cult is today.
It also becomes, more of a top-down power structure, right? I mean, then you have the Führer that knows all and must control all, opposed to the cult mysticism, which is more kind of individual experiences, right?
Top-down to a cartoonish degree.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. So basically, from 1934 to 1938, it's Wiligut that's really driving the occult influence in the party from a sort of theology standpoint. And then in 1938, Himmler finds out that Wiligut had spent time in a sanitarium or a mental asylum. And there were a lot of rumors about why he had been in that asylum, but the strongest evidence is that he thought that his channeling ability was tied to the fact that he was a male in his line, and that if he did not have a son, his channeling ability would not be passed on. And he kept having daughters. Yeah, he kept having daughters.
Strange. Okay.
And it drove him crazy. He got very violent towards his wife and his daughters.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And that's allegedly why he was in the asylum. But Himmler finds out about it and he says, this is going to be really embarrassing because I've been saying you are the Rasputin of Germany.
Right.
And it's going to look like you're crazy. So he forces Wiligut into an early retirement and basically sort of exiles him and puts him out of the way until he dies a few years later. So it doesn't end well for him or any of the people we're going to talk about, which at least there's that solace, right?
Right.
Wiligut kind of set the tone, but Himmler kept it going throughout. These occult influences were used as a form of like Nazi myth-making and a ritualization of the state. So one of the ways that they would do that is these Nuremberg rallies, and they would make them sort of mass rituals, right?
Right.
And they were really choreographed to be synchronized emotionally. And like there were speeches, there's torches, there's music, and the goal here was to induce a trance-like state or a euphoric state. And one of the scholars that I was watching being interviewed during this was a boy during Germany in World War II. And he was Jewish. And he was like 14 years old. And he goes to one of these Nuremberg rallies. And he hears Hitler speaking. And he said he had gotten so caught up in it, even though that he knew it was evil, he started cheering. And he said to this day, he still couldn't explain it. And this was one of the moments where I was researching a little bit. I'll admit, I'm a Fortean. I had this sort of idea that Hitler's charisma was described often as being almost supernatural. So I looked into that a little bit from that perspective and said, could I see anything here that would make me think that it was for sure supernatural? And I didn't. He did have some contact and lessons from an occultist that was also an actor. This man was said to have influenced Hitler heavily in his speech making. But at the time that he met with that man, he was already known for whipping up crowds and being able to turn a crowd of blue-collar workers into SS recruits.
Yeah, and you said that Hess actually believed that Hitler was the Messiah.
Yeah. And all of that happened before Hitler had those lessons, so...
Okay.
I tend to think that he was just unusually gifted in that. And if the phenomenon was involved, then it was probably from a long time back.
Yeah.
But there was something weird there. And the Nazis played into it. And they used those Nuremberg rallies and what they had, which was this unusually gifted orator, who was not very bright either. That was very clear in this research that Hitler was not a real smart guy. But this talent that he had was preternatural almost.
And let's not forget, the Nazis promoted the new technology of radios, right? So I remember hearing how that Nazis actually developed like a cheap version of radio so they could broadcast to as many people as possible. They
really understood the value of propaganda. And this is the problem with propagandists like Nazis, that they have no ethics. They have no guidelines, right? So they can lie. And like if I were to compare it to UFO research, you and I always talk about how we'll never be able to get the clickbait type traffic that other podcasts and websites do because we refuse to do that sort of clickbait.
Right.
And the Nazis were not afraid of that. It was like, whatever you're into, we're into, and it's Nazi, right?
Yeah. A certain level of shamelessness, I guess you call it. Or just having no shame.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a superpower.
That type of ruthlessness. And that was really what allowed people like Himmler, who, as I mentioned, was wimpy, and Hitler, who was kind of dumb, and neither of them were physically imposing Aryan supermen that they thought were so great.
Right, sure.
They were kind of dumpy and unattractive, and yet, and yet they rose to these positions. Right? And so Hitler was cast as this prophesized savior of Germany, and that gives people a central figure to drive towards. And then you have all these Nazi films. They were, like you said, that they were getting into radio. They were also way ahead in the use of video or way ahead in the use of film for propaganda.
Yeah, for sure.
And they were using Carl Jung-like archetypes to communicate deeper meaning and getting people within them. And these are occult ideas. They're both occult and cult with a C ideas. And they were in the Nazi Party.
But, it's just fascinating, too, though, because, the public or every household having a radio still was it wasn't there yet, but it was a new technology that helped them extend their power.
Absolutely.
Which you can make many parallels with that with other times in history.
Yeah, and they were searching for power. And that's really what it boiled down to. It didn't matter what religious object had power. They thought they were all tied to some sort of power. And they thought it all tied back to them, They drank their own Kool-Aid. It wasn't like some of them, like even Himmler, it wasn't like he thought, oh, I know I made this up. He made it up, and then he goes, I believe it.
Right.
They were looking for Atlantis. They were looking for Hyperborea. They were looking for Lemuria. They were investigating occult energy fields. They were investigating ley lines and shamanistic practices. They were in Tibet doing all sorts of meditation rituals that they were then bringing back into Wewelsburg Castle and practicing.
Right.
In that occult way where you make it your own, and they were making it Nazi. So going back into what actually happened of Fortean significance during the war, we do have to point to the astrologers and the channelers and the psychics that Nazis thought so much of. It's the one thing where I could even find conventional historians agreeing that some of the Nazi astrologers appeared to have found U-boats using a form of map dowsing.
Okay.
Folks are probably familiar with the idea of water dowsing, where you take a forked stick and you go out. And they also used this for mines during World War II. They're speaking of Fortean phenomena. They were finding mines. Americans were getting dowsers from the backwoods to go find mines using their mystic methods in World War II.
Interesting.
So, the Nazi dowsers were utilizing map dowsing, which involves taking a pendant, usually, and moving it around a map and putting your intent and your will and getting into that trance-like state until it starts making a movement. And they were able to find U-boats, which are submarines.
Right.
So
interesting.
That's impossible to do at random. Yeah. So I did find evidence where even conventional historians would back that much happened. So their interest in occultism kept dropping as obviously the war turned bad. Business of the day was really about survival. And so did Hitler's and Himmler's relationship continue to deteriorate. Because back when things were going well, he didn't really mind that Himmler was spending all of this money and all of these resources pursuing mystic things all over the planet. And Himmler was funding that himself through the SS, by the way. So Hitler wasn't backing it. It's a very misguided interpretation that Hitler was behind all of this. Himmler was finding ways to fund the Ahnenerbe himself so that it wasn't taking from war resources and that Hitler couldn't stop him.
Right.
But that all goes downhill as the war goes on, because as the situation in the war begins to deteriorate, so does their interest change from occultism towards advanced tech. At the outbreak of the war, occult practices are tolerated within SS circles, and that's in 1939, right? And then from 1940 to 1941, we start hearing of Foo Fighters And you're hearing these reports on both sides.
Right. Yeah.
The reports of Foo Fighters from then are identical to the reports of David Fravor and Alex Dietrich, who talked about their TikTok encounter. Identical.
Right. Yeah.
Where they said they thought they were engaged with these objects. There are some instances where there was strong evidence that some Allied aircraft and personnel had been injured or killed by weird phenomenon, and it had been covered up. There were Foo Fighter incidents that were recorded. There was even pictures of them. There's witness reports of those. That was happening. And I've always wondered, were they happening more for the Allies and more for the Axis? Was this part of this occult influence? Were they able to conjure some sort of Foo Fighter response in the sky? I don't know. I don't think that that's very clear. But
it's strange though, because you think about it, that's still going on today. It's just
it is.
I mean, we don't call them Foo Fighters, but I mean, not to change the subject, but just in recent news, there was a Navy rear admiral that's telling Congress that these objects, you call them Foo Fighters, are so commonplace today that their pilots are becoming desensitized by it.
Right.
So it's like decades of this.
At least like 100 years now. I mean, that we've been seeing this stuff. So, and then to keep pretending like it's new, to your point.
Right.
Those Foo Fighter reports are identical to the ones that happened in 2022, right? Like, so it doesn't really. The idea that disclosure is imminent is a bold-faced lie, guys.
Yep.
As 40 and 41 goes around, there's a lot more Foo Fighter incidents. 1941 comes, and Rudolf Hess sees the war turning sour towards Germany, and then he flies solo to Scotland, and he was driven by some sort of astrological advice. It's believed the advice came from Wilhelm Wulff, who was a noted astrologer in Germany at the time. And Hess believed that the cosmic forces that Wulff had identified would allow for a German-British alliance and the continued existence of Germany.
Right.
And, of course, that didn't happen. They took in Hess, right? And they said, hey, thanks for coming in. Tell us everything you know. And it was very damaging to the Nazi Party. And then Hitler says, that's it for occultism. And he tries to shut down astrology for a minute.
Right.
He's really picking on Himmler at that time and put Himmler into more military control. So even Himmler's not really as focused on it. There's still occult rituals happening within Wewelsburg Castle, and the SS is also running genocide at that point.
Right.
They're behind the concentration camps. And the stress gets to be too much for Himmler. From the time he was young, he was known to have a weak stomach. It would keep him in bed for hours at a time. And the more Adolf Hitler started to come down on Heinrich Himmler, their names sound similar. But the more Adolf started to come down on Heinrich, the worse Heinrich's stomach got. And the more he would be in bed for hours at a time and having his subordinates do all of this dirty work. But eventually, Adolf becomes very disgusted with Heinrich and says, okay, I'm demoting you from the military thing. You just stick with the concentration camps, right? And at this time, Germany's losing, right? Hess is now captured. The Allies know what he knows, and Hitler is desperate. So it's at this point where some of the best evidence we have in favor of this says that the Nazis started to really go after exotic technology that would have been inspired by UAP, that were inspired by gravitational fields. So some of it may not have been UAP inspired, but they were trying crazy stuff with science to win the war. We were trying crazy stuff with science too, like blowing up an atom. So they were trying all sorts of other things too.
Right.
And that gets very dicey. And we'll maybe talk about this more in the last episode, because as the Allies come in, all that stuff disappears. And then things start showing up here in the U.S., and things start showing up in Russia. But there were real technical innovations underway, namely the V-1 and V-2 rockets, which would then go on to change the world. And there were rumors among a lot of Allies, that there was psychic warfare going on, and that's not hard to believe. There was definitely dowsing happening and some other mystical technology. The Die Glocke is the bell in German, and this is believed by many, including me, to have been a bell-shaped object that the Nazis were trying to build. I don't know why it's that hard to believe that they were trying to build it. But then that Die Glocke ends up getting wrapped up in a bunch of lore and myth afterwards that I think makes it sound less believable, like they believe it actually may have been the Kecksburg crash. And it does resemble the Kecksburg crash, but we don't know. Like, I think if you just stopped at saying the Nazis were building exotic technology in Poland, you're dead on right, and you're at the beginning of a good investigation.
So this Die Glocke was some type of vessel?
Die Glocke was a alleged. I'm going to still say alleged because there isn't hard proof of this, but it was an alleged reproduction UFO vehicle that was shaped like a bell.
Oh, okay.
And it used some sort of field technology in order to levitate. But they were using some sort of field technology, and they weren't able to control it or steer it, and it was irradiating everyone who was getting close to it.
Oh, jeez.
That's not that hard to believe.
Yeah.
And that was all alleged to have happened in this complex called Der Riese in Poland, where we know it existed. And all of this stuff is in the notes that we have up on the website for this episode.
Right, and you can't go without, mentioning how Mussolini also had his top scientists trying to develop a super weapon.
Right, and just recently an advisor to JFK named Harold Malmgren gave a deathbed confession in an interview and said that the 1933 Magenta crash was real, and that he was aware of it, the Italy crash that Dave Grush said that we got post-World War II. So there's another person who was in a position to know, saying that this was true. So they would have had exposure to exotic technology, and that's not hard to believe. There's reverse engineering programs in the US, there's reverse engineering programs in Russia, there's reverse engineering programs in China. Germany was a major superpower at the time.
Yep. Yeah, it's understandable.
So as the war wears on, the Allies are closing in on Himmler and Hitler. Himmler attempts to cut a deal with the Allies, but he's also controlling the concentration camps, and he tries to use some of the people within the concentration camps as hostages, and it doesn't go well. The Allies don't believe him, so then he tries to kill everyone in the concentration camps, and he knows that the jig is up.
Yeah.
And Hitler finds out about it.
Oh, yeah.
Adolf finds out about it, and he had called Heinrich Himmler the loyal Heinrich all the way up to the end, and Heinrich's identity was very wrapped up in his belief in Adolf Hitler as the Teutonic myth and as Germany's destiny. So in his final days, what he gets is Adolf Hitler telling him that he's a traitor to him, Adolf, and that he's also a traitor to Germany, and strips him of all of his rank and titles. So Himmler tries to disappear into the crowd of German soldiers that's leaving, but he gets recognized. As they're getting ready to question him, he eats a cyanide pill and dies. And then we know how it ends for Hitler.
Yep.
Or do
Bullet
we?
to the head.
Or do we?
Yeah.
Because the evidence that Hitler died in that bunker is very light. After the collapse of the war, what happens to the Der Riese complex program? What happens to all this Nazi knowledge of how to propagandize and reprogram a society? What happens to all of their psychic research that we know that they were doing? What happens to a lot of these strange objects that they had recovered? Those get split up. Those get split up between the U.S. and World War II, right? Just like everything else. So I think we'll get into that I think we'll get into our third episode here.
But it's interesting. It's part of this discussion is that, it really is kind of this transformation when we talk about the occult, how they begin and why they begin, and how they can kind of transform into, like you said, the big C cult, where it becomes a power structure. It becomes it becomes almost like something that people internalize at first, and then it becomes externalized through a power structure, and then of course abused.
Yeah, I think what's super relevant here, and that I didn't know, what I found about the real history of the Thule Society and their influence, and both how important they were at the beginning, and then how important it was that Hitler shunted them to the side and then took control of the theology himself.
Right.
And we didn't dive too much into the Holocaust. But I think everything that we talked about was necessary for the Holocaust to happen, and it doesn't get talked about enough.
Right.
Because what it did was it gave the people of Germany who were involved in this activity a spiritual belief that would allow them to do inhuman things.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that there were concentration camps and gas chambers was because when Himmler was starting, and he was the eugenicist, right, in addition to his occult beliefs, and when he was starting with the SS and having them kill people that he thought was undesirable, which would have been Jews, which would have been Romani gypsies, which would have been homosexuals, which would have been a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
What he was having the SS do was they were going behind the main army, and then there would be death squads that would just put people to death by gunfire at the end. Women,
right.
Children, innocents. And it was messing up his soldiers so bad afterwards. And then Heinrich Himmler goes to visit one of those shooting sprees, and what he sees disturbs him so bad that he can't really deal with it for days. So what he comes up with is a way to industrialize death.
Oh.
And that becomes the gas chambers.
Right.
How that all relates to the occult. They were already killing people. Face to face. And you don't have people committing that type of genocide with Christian beliefs.
Right.
You had to separate them from their beliefs in order to get them to commit atrocities.
Right.
And it takes something on a spiritual level to remove people from their ethics in that way.
Yeah, it's not just pure loyalty. There's got to be a little bit more to it to gain and hold on to that loyalty. Yeah.
Especially when it came to the lower income workers who were already prone to belief. They were already big into belief. They were already believing all sorts of spiritual things. And they were easy targets.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
For a very evil agenda.
So yeah, that's pretty interesting when you talk about industrializing that type of genocide. I think that and you know, even loyalty, that concept of loyalty, that's still prevalent today. I mean, that is something you could see. I'm not saying genocide's prevalent today. I'm just saying the same machinations. Yeah, the same process. And man, my big line is, oh, you know, we live in extraordinary times, man.
Yeah.
But they can go south real quick.
Right. And understanding how people can get wrapped up in cults and the occult through these means, I think can help all of us today.
Yeah. And I like to use the parallel with technology too, because I think the radio, the first time, you know, Nazis were using public broadcasts, live broadcasts on the radio, that was a big deal. That fascinated people. That brought people in. And you see parallels now today. We have these new technologies emerging.
Memes.
And memes, of course. Yeah.
That's the new method.
And,
yeah.
And now they're AI generated memes too, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good preview for the next episode, where we talk about where these ideas went after the war and how they're impacting us today.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as always, you know, we could have talked about this for hours, but
there was so much in World War II we didn't get into. I feel like this was so abbreviated. I months of stuff, and I'm like, but it was a good overview. Yeah,
it's definitely a good overview, and we'll continue this in the next episode. Thanks a lot, Ram.
Thank you, Bones. Looking forward to the next one.
Thanks for listening, everyone. And again, you can see a lot of this information we talk about on 14winds.com.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for listening.